So our readings for this week in the Bible in a Year series focus on 2 Kings 18, some chapters from 2 Chronicles, Psalm 48, Hosea, the whole book of Hosea, and then the last 5 chapters of Luke's Gospel. I want to just point out a slightly recurring theme in some of those texts, which is the idea of a great king, the role of Jerusalem, and roles of judgment and salvation as well. And as well as thinking about the big picture of the Bible. So Hezekiah was seen as, in some ways, a great king full of hope, but made mistakes as well. And then we read stories of threats to Jerusalem that were delivered. We'll find that later. And we read in Psalm 48, a great psalm of deliverance about how God will preserve Jerusalem. And as we know from how the story unfolds, that will not always be the case because of judgment against Jerusalem. The book of Hosea is quite a difficult book to read in some ways, but some very big themes of faithfulness or unfaithfulness to God, very strong imagery. And this wonderful chapter towards the end where we see God wrestling with the need for punishment of sin, yet he's wrestling with himself because he doesn't want to punish, he wants to save because he loves Israel so much. So that wrestling we see in the heart of God in the book of Hosea. And of course that leads us on to the book of Luke, the last 5 chapters of Luke, which is the culmination of the whole Gospel of Luke. And towards the end we read about Jesus' death and resurrection. And in many ways, we see that similar wrestling, I think, within the heart of God, that he does not want to see his son punished for the sins of the world. Yet that is his great wrestling and his great love for us, that he sent his one and only son to die for us. And just to pause on the big picture, we get the stories in chapter 24 after the resurrection. And we have this amazing Bible study that must have been, and Jesus takes the disciples who we met on the road to Emmaus through the Bible. And then later on, he encounters the disciples and he explains to them that what had happened to him was foretold in the scriptures. And so we read in 24:45, and he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. He told them, this is what is written, that Christ will suffer and rise from the dead on the 3rd day, and repentance and forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. Jerusalem is his keeping. You are my witnesses of these things. I'm going to send you what my father's promised, but stay in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high. In some ways, that passage is a real focal point of the whole biblical story, because Jesus is saying, everything leading up to it has been leading up to Jesus' death and resurrection and the proclaiming of that good news of salvation. And so he commits his followers to proclaiming that. So that's a really key moment in the biblical story. You can see there are some threads coming together. And over the weeks, we'll see in Luke's Gospel, as it's narrowed down from a sort of global vista to Jerusalem, how we know in the book of Acts, it will expand from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. And that's what we'll be looking at over coming weeks.